We are now ready to start session 5, the politics of U.S.China relations, irreconcilable differences or possibilities for progress. Now, we had a change in our program. As of minutes ago, Jim McGregor couldn't be with us today, so stepping in to moderate is Mary Kay Magistad. She's a longtime award-winning journalist who was previously based in China. She's also Associate Director at Asia Society Center on U.S.China Relations. Mary Kay, we are in debt to you. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you, Margaret. Thank you all for being here. And thank you to our two very, very deeply knowledgeable panelists who I will introduce you to in just one moment. So we're here to talk about the politics of U.S.-China relations on many levels. At least I think about U.S.-China relations on many levels. There's the level you just heard Kevin Rudd talking about, the government-to-government level. There's the business-to-business level. There's the people-to-people level. There's the educational and research level, and we've heard a little about that throughout the morning. We'll be touching on several of these in our 45 minutes. We'll talk first for about half an hour, and then we'll go to your questions. So keep in mind what you'd like to ask, and I'll be coming to you after we've had a conversation. So I thought in kicking this off, we might want to think about kind of what the U.S. and China have in common at this moment as they're approaching their relations. Both started 2023 with both continuity and change in government. China has a new Politburo Standing Committee, which is largely, in fact, entirely filled with Xi Jinping loyalists. In the United States, of course, we still have President Biden and we still have a Democratic Senate, but we have Republicans now controlling the House and starting a select committee on China. Both China and the U.S. face economic challenges, high inflation in the United States, though it's now coming down to about 6% and change. There's much reduced growth in China, and that's more of a secular change, although it's certainly been made worse by zero COVID policies, which have now suddenly been taken off, and that's created some of its own problems. Both the U.S. and China have populations with a strong patriotic or nationalistic streak, and a belief that their country is playing a leading role, a belief that their country playing a leading role in the world is good for the world, but also a population that sometimes questions why government aid and investment from either place is going overseas when there are problems at home. Each views the other as its primary global competitor, but also as an important trading partner and sometimes a partner on other issues like climate change. And both see it as their right to project power in their neighborhood and beyond. And neither is spoiling to go to war with the other, though both are preparing just in case. So to talk about this very complex relationship, I have with me Lingling Wei, who's the chief China correspondent for the Wall Street Journal, spent almost a decade in Beijing in China for the Journal, and she's also a co-author of the book Superpower Showdown. And Jim Messina was President Obama's Deputy Chief of Staff for Operations, 2009 to 2011. He's been a political advisor for campaigns and candidates in the UK, Spain, and Italy, and he's CEO of the Messina Group. I'm going to start with a question based on what this whole conference is called, moving towards the edge. So to stretch the metaphor to the point where it's screaming for mercy, are we moving towards the edge? Are we backing away from it? Are we teetering over it? And if so, what's causing that to happen right now in this moment? Jim, why don't I start with you?
Perfect. So I think we're teetering. I think you'd say in general we are going as close to the edge as we can. Maybe there's been a little in the last month or two, if you're being optimistic, a little bit of a, since the G20 meetings, a little bit of a step back, but we were depressing each other over lunch, how cynical we are over this, and how I think it is difficult. Let me just talk for the U.S. for a second. In the U.S. right now, with our new exciting divided government, they really only agree on two things. They agree on China and they agree on going after big tech. And if you look at that kind of bipartisanship, it's really about politics. It's very little about the substance. In the last presidential campaign between Donald Trump and Joe Biden, they ran more television ads against China than they did about COVID or the economy combined. And China has become the boogeyman for a variety of reasons, but especially with Midwestern swing voters. And so you have both parties attempting to out-tough China with each other. And you saw that this week after 917 votes for Kevin McCarthy's speakership. That's my own approximation. It was actually 14, but it seemed like 900. They then passed the only bipartisan thing they have done, the Select Committee on China, which got 365 votes. And that is literally the only thing both parties have agreed to so far. Now, I think the question is what both parties want out of that Select Committee, and I know you want to talk about that in a while. But the politics are clearly in the United States for more confrontation, with the exception, and you mentioned this, of climate change. Almost everything else, I think both sides have stopped talking to each other. When I was White House Deputy Chief of Staff, my theory of the case was always engagement and discussions are good. And now today, they don't even have those with their Chinese counterparts. Both sides are blindsided by what the other side is doing. My Chinese friends say we're blindsided by Biden's move on semiconductors and the timing of it. The U.S. intelligence apparatus was blindsided by President Xi's movement on COVID. And you start to have real ongoing political and military problems when you stop talking. And I think that's kind of where we are right now.
Lingling, what do you think?
Yeah, I just wanted to add a lot of Chinese within China were also blindsided by the U-turn on zero COVID. But I hear you, Jim. You know, the lack of communication on all levels really is a huge problem. I was talking to some Chinese officials. They were counting the number of lines of communication between the two sides in the past. They were like, you know, hundreds of that kind of communication, and now zero, right? So it's very problematic. And you know, from the Chinese side, I think it's very important to understand or try to understand what really drives Xi Jinping these days, right? One major driver behind his decision making and leadership really is realization that China and the U.S. are, you know, involved in this very heightened competition. You know, China in the past few years has been spending a lot of effort to try to fortify the Chinese economy, make it more geopolitically resistant, right, against Western sanctions, especially sanctions from the United States. You know, the latest, one of the most recent reports from official accounts from China, you know, talking about how the new leadership was selected. You know, new senior officials were selected. One of the criteria was, you know, your ability to guard against Western sanctions. Your ability to figure out ways to make China's economy, especially in terms of tech, more self-reliant. So that is a criteria for selecting top officials. So I do think, you know, as also Mary Kay was talking about, you know, but neither side wants to be in a like outright gunfight. Knock on wood, not yet. But if, you know, China is making preparations, you know, so it's the United States, and Xi Jinping wants to make sure that if there is a crisis like that, you know, China can win, right? So I do think this competition with the United States has become a reality for the Chinese leadership, and it really drives a lot of their policy making. And so far this year, we have seen some, you know, course correction, or however you call it, you know, a little bit of return to a more pragmatic approach.
Pulling back from wolf warrior diplomacy to some extent.
To some extent, you know, rhetoric kind of changes a little bit with the intention to lower the temperature of geopolitical tensions, especially with the United States, because not because they think the U.S. is no longer a threat. It's because domestic problems in China. The economy really is struggling. The latest Wendy Culler at the a panel earlier this morning really laid out all the major challenges faced by the economy, even in terms of trade, exports. So far have been this huge driver for China's economy. Showed the first decline in October in 2.5 years. Supply chains shifting out of China. A lot of younger people, young generation couldn't find jobs. Those are all very worrying things for the leadership to deal with. So they're trying to, strategically doing some tactical retreat, right? Lowering the temperature so that they can focus on proper up growth again for this year. So overall, we're seeing a more pro-growth, a little bit more pragmatic approach. However, the question really is the depth and how long this kind of pragmatic approach will last, and the depth of it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And there's also the question of how long this, sort of economic malaise is going to continue for China, whether this is something that they can grow out of, or whether this is more of a secular shift. With a contracting workforce, with an aging population, and this is a good thing, a larger population of college graduates, but they expect a different kind of job and they expect a different level of pay. And there aren't necessarily enough of those kinds of jobs, which contributes to the, 19% unemployment for youth.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, you have a number of Chinese young people who are, part of the lay down movement, right?
Right.
Well, if I thought the deal was that you were going to, sort of allow us to continue to have an ever better standard of living, Chinese Communist Party. And I don't see that happening, and I don't want to have to work 12 hours a day, 6 days a week for not very much money in a job that doesn't matter to me, so I'm just going to go move to a smaller town. And Xi Jinping has railed against this and said that, basically the youth of China have to develop, have to get a backbone and work for the country. It feels like there are a lot of things happening all at once that are somewhat related to COVID, probably accelerated by COVID, but some of them were happening beforehand. I mean, even the idea that China needs to be self-reliant, that goes back to 2005 with the Indigenous Innovation
Yes.
Campaign, and there have been various efforts since then. Even as China has been expanding its footprint in the world through the Belt and Road Initiative and basically trying to emerge as a global player. As you're looking at all of these economic challenges and the often said conventional wisdom about the Communist Party that its top goal is to stay in power, first of all, do you think that's fair? And secondly, as they're looking at if the way we stay in power is to keep delivering economically for our population, what do you see as the biggest challenges now for the party?
That's a great question. For sure, staying in power for both the party and Xi himself, probably the utmost important agenda, right?
Yeah.
So as you pointed out, traditionally there has been this unspoken social contract between the party and the public. The parties, as long as the party continues to deliver prosperity and growth for the people, the people will accept your leadership, your rule, without questioning too much. But that social contract has been gradually fraying in the past couple of years with growth rates slowing. A lot that go way back to before President Xi came to power, right? China's structural economic problems really started during Wen years, many years ago. But it was the slowdown growth really has accelerated in recent years, and partly because policy changes. So I think the leadership has tried to rewrite the social contract from one that based on economic performance to one that based on just making Chinese proud being Chinese, right? That's why you're seeing, this little pinks, older pinks, the more nationalistic sentiment popping up in China, that, kind of tit for tat approach to the Western world. Why should we, be bossed around anymore? We should just be proud of Chinese, be proud of our system, be proud of our culture. However, that hasn't really taken hold, right? We have seen people still want to be able to continue to make money, have better future for their children and their children's children. What struck me the most last year was when I heard this story of a very young family in Shanghai. One of the family members tested positive for COVID, and the local community official knocked on their door and said, you had to go to this quarantine facility for forced quarantine. And the husband just said, no, we're not going. Whatever happens. We're the last generation of our family anyway. Meaning they had no desire to have kids. Why bother? Because we don't feel like the future would be any brighter than what we're already having. That really struck me. I never experienced anything like that when talking to friends, family. You guys know how Chinese people are. They're so hardworking, so driven, and so dynamic. The Chinese society, probably one of the most dynamic societies in the whole world. And nowadays, increasingly they're wondering if the best days are behind China. I think that really should. If it hasn't concerned the party, it really should concern the party now.
So understanding domestic realities like that is crucial for having effective policy with a major power and partner and competitor. Jim, when you think about your time in the Obama administration and kind of what that level of understanding was, in your opinion, about what was going on in China then, and where we are now in terms of government, Congress, really understanding kind of some of these tensions domestically for China, where do you think we are?
Sadly, light years away. Look, I think a couple things, just to play off what you were saying. This economic issue isn't just about China. It's also about the U.S., the Europeans. I have a dozen presidents and prime ministers as my clients, and I joke with my team all the time, every election's an economic election. I don't care what anyone says. And this is part of the problem that U.S. and China don't understand each other's politics, right? President Biden, it isn't the Obama years anymore. We have the first inflation in 40 years. When I ran the Obama re-elect, I had to go in and tell the cabinet to stop saying the American dream because voters no longer believed it. This generation of young Americans is the first generation in American history that believes that their generation will be worse off than their parents. Much like you were saying the Chinese do. That reality significantly weakens the hand of sitting presidents and Congress about what they can do. The Midwestern voter didn't wake up one day and said, hey, let's go blame China. They woke up and said, our world is getting much tougher and has gotten tougher for 30 years. Something's to blame. What is it? And they, when I was a baby, I went to Washington to work for my senator who later became the ambassador to China, Max Baucus, and the very first bill he had me work on was China Most Favored Nation status, which was bipartisan, which was a very big deal saying we're all better if we do this together. I think the folks in China thought that Joe Biden was going to come back and bring in the old days of the way they had relationships with Bush and Obama. That just fundamentally isn't true. And the reason why it's not true is that there's now an assessment that the great struggle of our time is going to be this competition between U.S. and China. And it makes it really hard to sort of work together. Similarly, there's no sort of assessment about what working together looks like. When I was White House Deputy Chief of Staff, I knew exactly what we wanted out of Team China. And I knew what the theory of the case was and why engagement was good. I think it's fair to say neither side understands what they want out of this relationship. And they're trying to figure it out. It is likely, I'm not making any predictions, but just given history and data, that Joe Biden and President Xi are going to deal with each other for the next 6 years. And so it's now time to, from your very first question, step back from the brink and say, where are there places we can work together? It is unlikely to be on chips and TikTok and controversial things like that. It is probably more in soft things like the environment.
Yeah. So one place where there's bipartisan interest and support is, as you said, in competing with China. There's a new select committee in the House under Mike Gallagher, chaired by Mike Gallagher. What do you think this committee could do that would actually support and promote U.S. interests related to China without doing damage, unnecessary damage? And how much are Democrats, in your view, willing to get on board with those sorts of initiatives?
I think this might be the only interesting thing to watch this year in the House of Representatives, in part because it was so bipartisan. I didn't see 365 people voting for this thing, and they did. I think the problem is both parties want drastically different things out of this. Republicans want some movement on intellectual property. They want some movement on trade deficits, and they want some movement on privacy spying stuff. Democrats want movement on human rights. They want movement on kind of the environment stuff. And if you look at what Gallagher said in the announcement of the committee, I was very heartened. Because he said, look, we really want to focus on the U.S. first and figure out what are the things we need to get together to be a better competitor to China. But then if you look at his statements and look at some of the bipartisan statements of both sides, it was way more to heck with China. We got to go after them on A, B, and C. So to your question, I think it's the best question. What should they actually do? They actually should look at our education system and say, how do we compete? They should continue to, we've had a very good year on semiconductors and batteries and the Inflation Reduction Act. They had to triple down on all of that stuff and figure out what are the things we could do. And they probably should care a little bit less about telling China what to do in their house.
On education, do you think that should include allowing Chinese students and researchers to come into the U.S.? I mean, do you think that's something that they would consider, rather than just ask your opinion,
yeah.
although I'm interested in that too?
Yes.
What do you think that the Select Committee is willing to consider in terms of allowing top, Chinese researchers and students to come to the States, which long fed innovation here?
It's an interesting question because after 25 years of living in Washington, D.C., which I always say is a 10 square mile logic-free zone, I have now moved to San Francisco, which is a much bigger, totally logic zone. And one of the problems of the last 5 years in the U.S.-China relationship is we basically stopped the back and forth with students. And it's really hurting American tech companies in ways that we don't fully understand. And both sides, I think, need to figure out more ways to restart that and allow that kind of collaboration in those students, because it'll make both sides better. Going to our lunch, I'm cynical about whether or not that's going to come out of the Select Committee. I would be willing to place a lot of money in Vegas. It won't. But I think there is smart people on both sides who understand that. And for as excited as we're all going to get about the Select Committee, I would remind the voters that that it's unlikely that any of the things they're going to recommend are going to become law. And instead, really, the only person who matters sort of in the actual relationship is the administration and Biden, because he has so much administrative authority to do a bunch of the stuff directly with China. I hope that they fund education. I hope they do some stuff that they're talking about. But mostly it's about what Joe Biden and President Xi are going to do. And the select committee will just be fun to watch it for the carnage.
Okay. Lingling, you've called both China and the U.S. home. You've reported in both places. What do you think are the biggest misperceptions in the U.S. in general and in the U.S. government in particular about China? And what do you think are the biggest misperceptions in China about, particularly in the government, about the U.S.?
Right, that's a tough question. I'll try. So, yes, I would just say that, obviously, China's system is dominated by one party and increasingly one person. Still, I do still think there are many different voices within the government, within the society. That is not everyone is, anti the U.S. or, thinking the West is bad, is here to bring us down. This is a totally debatable question, and I've been going through that. I often wondered whether or not the U.S. administration should have done a better job in terms of cultivating more liberal voices within the Chinese system. Back during the trade war, I covered trade wars throughout and actually co-wrote a book about it. What struck me was, a lot of, throughout the process, there are actually people within the Chinese government who wanted to utilize Trump's pressure to push forward some market-oriented changes in China. But because the pressure from the Trump administration was so rapid fire and so heavy, and that left very little room for those more liberal voices to actually have any space, have any room for speaking up. Because once you advocate that kind of thing, you would be seen as sort of like giving in to American pressure. And in today's China, during the WTO era, that was different. China was not as strong, right? They needed the American help to get into WTO no matter what. But today's China is the second largest economy. We shouldn't be bossed around anymore. So foreign pressure that used to work many years ago no longer works and actually become more counterproductive. And those Chinese officials, those more liberal voices were actually, eliminated as a result. So, but again, I am not trying to just justify certain actions in China. Fundamentally, China has also changed, the more repressive policies and stuff. But sometimes I do wonder if it would have made a difference, more effort was spent in terms of cultivating more liberal voices within the government.
Can I play off that for a second?
Please.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. I think both sides missed glaring sort of opportunities about each other. There's this phrase in China, never forgive a national humiliation. And President Trump's politics were about humiliation.
Yeah.
And so when he went so hard after China, I totally agree with you. My friends there said there's no way to compromise.
Yeah.
On the other side, there's this assessment in Washington that Xi will never move, and that it's useless to try to move him because he's just the only person that matters. And and that may not be as true as it used to be. Clearly, he moved major on the COVID stuff very quickly.
Right.
And there's kind of this assessment in Washington that the Chinese are going to do what the Chinese are going to do, so we should just get our own house in order. And that probably isn't true either. And so, we do need to kind of go back to a place where we start talking to each other again.
Yeah.
Right. I'll just just quickly answer a question about common misconception among the Chinese of the Americans. I think, a lot of Chinese, especially among the officials, they think, oh, all those capitalists, right? Capitalists are in pursuit of profits and money. They have no values. And look, Russia's invasion of Ukraine woke up a lot of Chinese. Actually, they have values. And they actually, U.S. and Europe work together to have a concerted effort to sanction Russia, despite, the commercial interests have been lost along the way. So I think that's a common misconception among some Chinese, at least some Chinese Americans, like, you're all capitalists. Wall Street kind of represents America, but that's so not true.
Yeah, I'll add to that just one misperception that I heard a lot when I was still based in China, reporting in China in the late, 2009, 10, 11, 12, 13, after the financial crisis, that it was sort of well, you guys are clearly heading into the dustbin of history, and now it's our turn to rise, and just step aside and don't make us have to use energy to make this happen, right? And the U.S. has managed to hang in there, and China's now facing challenges that maybe weren't entirely anticipated back then, when there was a pretty steep trajectory, it seemed, going up and going out into the world. Yeah. It just goes to show, you can only have so much foresight, and if you assume that, you're going to go in a straight line toward your goal, you're probably going to be wrong. We're going to go to questions in about 5 minutes, but I have one final question for each of you first. Jim, you mentioned early on in this conversation that one of the places where the U.S. and China can cooperate is related to climate change. Mm-hmm. Obviously, there's government-to-government, policy cooperation on climate change, or there can be. The two governments now have both been implementing some policies that encourage more use of renewable energy, even as China is still having a hard time moving as quickly away from coal as had been planned earlier. But on a business-to-business level, you work with several companies, including those that are related to energy. What do you think could happen that would be net good for all of us, not just the U.S. and China, but everyone in the world affected by climate change? Like, how could there be an accelerating effect from businesses working together, which wouldn't, there wouldn't be a problem with national security interests?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I think, the fundamental question of our generation is going to be, can we wrap our hands around this climate change issue? And China and the U.S. are the two largest economies and the two largest polluters. And so they desperately need each other in this discussion. And, Gary, Rochelle, and I serve on the board of a joint China-U.S. alternative energy company that operates in both countries, and I've kind of got to see both sides of this. I was so excited about being at this conference today because this morning in Washington it leaked that the Biden administration is getting ready for another round of reverse CFIUS rules, saying American people can't invest in Chinese AI, quantum, and chips. But they specifically left open batteries and renewables. And they did it for a very straight reason, which is that that's going to be the one place where both teams really need each other. And the Trump assessment was, she's never going to move, so we need to separate the economies and do our own thing. And the truth is, we need to move so fast on getting to 1.5, and we need to move these two economies so fast that you're going to need the back and forth. You're going to need access to cheaper Chinese technologies. You're going to need access to lithium and advanced chips and other things that you're just going to have. And we're still figuring out a bunch of the science together. And so that's one place where I think both sides understand that. I read that John Kerry and his Chinese counterpart had 9 meetings during the G20 just about this. And that's actually the kind of conversations that you and I were talking about have to have. And when I go around my new hometown of San Francisco and see the exciting technologies for all these people that are half my age they're inventing, it's not social media platforms that excite me. It's stuff in the biotech, energy, climate change space. And their friends in China are doing the same thing. And that competition and collaboration could be the key to the entire future of our planet. So that's one place. See, we tried to find one place we could be optimistic, and maybe that's the one place.
There you go. And there is certainly muscle memory in Silicon Valley of having close collaboration with Shenzhen and with, basically the factory belt in southern China.
That's exactly right.
So one other place where I don't know if it's optimism or if it's just an interesting thing that was revealed in China by the protests over zero COVID. I wonder how you read that, Lingling, in terms of, what prompted so many people to come out in the streets this time? Why did it become a national set of protests so quickly? What lingering effect do you think it will have in terms of people, however incrementally, feeling a little bit more empowered because for whatever reason the government did shift the policy after this happened?
Exactly. So the protests definitely accelerated the decision making when it comes to abandoning zero COVID, because as recent as mid-November, the signal was still kind of a little wishy-washy, right? On one hand, they put out 20 guidelines to ease COVID restrictions. On the other hand, People's Daily continued with editorials about unswervingly sticking to zero COVID. So that caused a lot of confusion and uncertainty, especially among local governments. And some officials even doubled down on COVID restrictions. That led to a lot of people who were already so fed up with continued lockdowns, restrictions on their movements, to really finally take to the street. That basically the fundamental reason behind the protests. But I also want to point it out because, there are basically two major issues that are shown from the protesters. One was against zero COVID. The other, you have seen people, very young, and oftentimes young female college students so bravely, courageously, holding up sheets of white paper. And that's not just about COVID, right? It's also a reflection of the frustration with not being able to speak up. So I think that really alarmed the central leadership and caused the very sudden abrupt U-turn on zero COVID. And following the protests, there, from my conversations with friends and contacts back in China, there is actually quite a bit of soul searching among the younger generation, right? A lot of them grew up with a rising China. They never experienced cultural revolution, great leap forward. They only knew China just being more and more stronger and economically more developed. And so should they be like their parents and grandparents, continue to be deferential to authorities, or should they just, like any kids in America or other countries, and continue to try to start to really fight for their own rights? Even, the so-called little pinks, the term for ultra-nationalistic younger generation, there has been a turn in sentiment among those little pinks about, should we challenge the party, the authorities on certain policies? I think that's definitely, if we have to look for positives, I think anything that provokes people to think differently and to look for change, and that should be positive.
Yeah. And in some ways, having nationwide protests over one issue is very rare in China. The last time really was Tiananmen, but there were protests.
It happened in the first place was kind of mind-boggling. I was, where were the security people?
Yeah,
right?
yeah. But I was going to say, but certainly during the time I was in China, and especially the first dozen years of the 2000s, there were, tens of thousands, sometimes more than 100,000 protests a year, right?
Right.
It's just that they weren't all organized. They weren't all about the same thing. And so
Right.
the party kind of tolerated them and peeled people off and dealt with them, bargained with some, jailed others.
Right.
So this is in some ways returning to a norm, but in other ways it's very different because people were all united in their
Yeah.
frustration about COVID because everyone was having that experience.
You know what? I think it was an oversight. I think it was, the protests took place right after the party congress. Throughout the party congress and right before and after, the security was super tight.
As it
and
always
those
is.
people overworked, and now they finally had a break. And then that's when the protests took place.
Questions? I see a hand right there, right in the middle.
Hi, thank you for a great discussion. My name is Matt Boswell, and I come from the Stanford Center on China's Economy and Institutions. And I have a two-part question. First part of the question is, the new select committee actually doesn't reference China per se, or at least its title doesn't. It references the Chinese Communist Party. And I'm curious if that is just a one-off rhetorical shift, or if we can expect ongoing distinctions in official representations about the CCP versus China. That's part one. And part two is, since Jim, you mentioned that so much depends on what the Biden administration does, within the executive branch, where do you see, whether it's state or NSC or DOD or Commerce, the principal sort of centers of gravity for China policy, and is there daylight between them?
So let me answer the first one first. I would refer you, and I think he actually gave it here, but Peter Thiel gave a speech recently that saying to the Republicans, you guys got to stop with this back and forth on abortion, these other issues, and the only thing you ought to care about is this lifetime struggle with the Chinese Communist Party. And that rhetoric has been tested and really well polled, and that is now the words that Republicans are told to use. So I think you'll continue to see that. As a Democrat, I don't care, they can call it whatever they want. Second, on the question, what was your second question? Sorry. Oh, yeah. So the interesting thing about this, I ran processes in the White House, and you always, to your point, you have all these constituents, and what deputy chiefs of staff do is slam all their heads together and say, let's get an actual recommendation for the president. And they almost never agree with each other, and you sort of, control the paper and try to get it. On this issue, it seems to me to be so far, with the exception of Commerce, that most of the agencies are all trying to out-China each other and out-hardline each other. And you see that in what they say, you see that in the work product. I think Raimondo's in a different place. It's my own assessment. I've never hung out and done shots with her and talked about China, but that is my theory of the case. And I think you'll continue to see Blinken's going to run the process. Blinken is a very powerful Secretary of State because of his personal relationship with the president, and because of, he set the tone in the very first meeting with his counterpart, and that was the reminder to China that it wasn't going to go back to the Obama days, that we were going to stay with the hard line, and they've continued to do that. So I think you're going to see less daylight on the China stuff than in things that I ran 10 years ago.
Looking for hands. Over here.
Yes, John Bond, Tessiac Corporation. We tend to talk about China and the United States as monoliths. Historically, the dissent centers in China were in the provinces. We seem now to look at whether or not they are national. China is not subject to, at least in the perception of the United States, China is not subject to the whims of public opinion as the United States is, which has a dramatic impact on China policy as well as everything else. Is it possible with these two very different systems, A, Are there any seeds in the provinces of dissent? And B, is it possible where you have a fashion kind of driven public policy in the United States against a monolithic policy in China?
That's a great
Lingling?
question. Sure. Great question, tough one. Their dissent on local levels in China. Well, you know, different localities in China is anything but monolithic, that's for sure. You know, a lot of different localities have really vast different interests. And, you know, I'm not, you know, before the Xi Jinping era, the new era, the power was more decentralized in China, right? So a big change Xi Jinping has made to, you know, the Chinese system is really greatly centralized decision making into Beijing, and particularly, you know, into the hands of his own and his inner circle. So even if there are dissents, you know, on the local level, I'm sure there are. Does that matter? You know, how much that matters is really questionable. And especially, you know, after the 20th Party Congress, we have seen the lineup of top leadership, and also have seen personnel changes in many key localities in China, and they're all the president's men. So it's, you know, so far we haven't seen vastly different opinions being voiced from those areas, and so I would hope actually there are more different voices, you know, opinions, a return to a more dynamic, you know, policy debate and policy discussion, because that's really the formula for sound policy, not, you know, just rule by gut, that kind of decision making.
That's a great place to wrap this up. You've given such substantive answers that I'm sorry we only have time for those 2 questions. Lingling, Jim, thank you so much for really great meaty discussion.
Thank you for the question. Thank you.